There's a weird pattern that shows up in folklore. When people imagine monsters, they didn't always put them in the deep forest. They didn't always hide them in a cave, or a cursed mountain, or some ruin nobody was supposed to enter. A lot of the time, they put the monster right next door. The person you passed in the market, the woman who smiled at you during the day. You know, the cute one. The neighbor whose house went dark a little too early. Or in some cases, the relative you had already buried. That's the part that caught my attention. Because if you compare old European vampire stories with the Filipino aswang and manananggal folklore, they shouldn't have much in common. Different places, different histories, completely different monsters. But somehow they keep circling the same fear. Not just the fear of death, not just the fear of the dark. The fear that something familiar might only be pretending to be safe. So, in this episode, we're looking at the monster that looked human, the European vampire, the Filipino aswang, and the manananggal, and why so many cultures imagined a predator that did not come from outside the village, but from inside it. Before vampires became romantic, elegant, or weirdly attractive, they were honestly disgusting. And I don't mean that as a joke. I mean the older folklore versions of the vampire was not this pale aristocrat standing in a castle window with a cape. Modern vampires kind of got this serious PR upgrade, going from bloated village corpse to tragic immortal rich heartthrob sparkling is honestly quite impressive branding. The older vampire was much closer to a corpse that had gone wrong, a body in the grave that people believe was not staying dead. In parts of Eastern Europe, especially during the vampire panics of the 1700s, villagers genuinely believed the dead could return and feed on the living. One of the most famous cases was Peter Blagojevic, a Serbian man who died in 1725 after he was buried. Other people in the village started dying. According to the accounts, some claimed before his death that Blagojevic had come back to visit them. So the villagers did what sounds horrifying to us right now. They dug him up. And this is where the story gets uncomfortable because when suspected vampires were exhumed, people sometimes found bodies that looked wrong: bloated, ruddy, fluid or blood around the mouth, skin pulling back in ways that made the hair and nails look like they had kept growing. To us, that sounds like decomposition. To them, it looked like evidence. And honestly, I kind of get why that would scare people. Modern forensic knowledge gives us a different explanation. As a body decomposes and gases build up inside it, the pressure can push fluids from the lungs and stomach upward through the mouth and nose. Skin can dry and contract, creating the illusion that hairs and nails are still growing. So the villagers may have been describing something real, they just didn't know what it meant. And that might be the most tragic part of the vampire panic. The vampire was not just a monster, it was an answer. A terrible answer, but still an answer. If a disease moved through a household, killing one person after another, people needed some way to explain why. Some modern researchers have pointed to diseases like tuberculosis, rabies, and other contagious illnesses as possible influences on the vampire belief. Not as one perfect explanation for every vampire story, but as part of the world those stories came from. Because before modern medicine, disease could feel personal, it could feel targeted, it could feel like something was choosing people, and the monster is easier to understand than an invisible infection. A monster has a body, a grave, a name. You can dig it up. You can stake it, you can burn it, you can do something. That is probably one reason the vampire was so frightening. It was not some random demon from the wilderness. It was your dead neighbor, your dead husband, your dead brother. Someone who was supposed to be gone, but maybe wasn't. In the Philippines, this fear takes a different shape. The aswang is not exactly one creature, it is more like a category of creatures: ghouls, shapeshifters, witches, corpse eaters, and night predators. Different regions have different versions, and the stories change depending on where you hear them. But one of the most disturbing forms is the manananggal. The name is often connected to the idea of separation or removal that fits the image perfectly. By day, the manananggal looks human. In some stories, she's beautiful. In others, she's married. She might live normally in the community, talk to people, keep relationships, and pass completely unnoticed. But at night, the story changes. She separates from the lower half of her body and grows wings and flies out into the dark. That image alone is disturbing. But what makes the Manananggal worse is not just the transformation, it is where she hunts. She does not only attack people on empty roads or deep in the forests. In many versions, she comes to the house, she lands on the roof, she searches for people when they are asleep, vulnerable, and unable to defend themselves. Many versions of the folklore focus especially on expecting mothers and the life they carry. Some tellings describe this in a much more graphic term, but we don't need to sit in the gore for the fear to make sense. The point is already horrible. The home is not safe. The roof is not safe. Sleep is not safe. Even pregnancy, something tied to the family and new life, becomes surrounded by danger. Imagine taking that belief seriously. You're not just afraid of something outside the house, you're afraid of what might come through the roof while everyone is asleep. So the folklore develops defenses: salt, garlic, ash, spices, and sharp objects. And to destroy the Manananggal, the story says you have to find the lower half of her body before dawn and prevent her from reattaching. That is one of the strangest parts of the legend. According to some version, she hides that lower half somewhere in the landscape. One repeated image is the banana grove, where the trunks can resemble legs in the dark. Maybe if you do find a pair of legs there, maybe you could put some salt and some ghost peppers in there just to make things extra spicy for the manananggal, if ever you did find something like that there. However, unlike the European vampire, the manananggal is not usually considered a dead body returning from the grave. She's alive. That difference matters. The European vampire is the fear that the dead might not stay dead. The manananggal is the fear that someone living among you is not what they seem. And in some ways, that may be worse, because a corpse in a grave is at least in one place. A living monster can smile at you in the morning. Now, I want to be careful here. I'm not saying the European vampire and the Manananggal are secretly the same creature. They're not. One is dead, one is living. One rises from the grave, one rises into the sky. One belongs to European revenant traditions, the other belongs to the wider Filipino aswang complex. So this is not a direct historical connection. It is more like two different cultures arriving at a similar emotional problem. Both monsters take the familiar and make it dangerous. A monster in the forest is scary because it is unknown, but a monster next door is scary because it is known. Or at least you thought it was. That is the part that makes this kind of folklore stick. It doesn't only ask, what is hiding out there? It asks, what is hiding in the people around me? The more you look at it, the more practical these stories become. If a family member died because of an illness no one understood, the vampire gave that fear a face. If pregnancy ended in tragedy, some scholars and interpreters suggest the manananggal gave that grief a predator. If children wandered too far, the aswang could become a warning. If a community feared outsiders, illness, strange behavior, independent women, or anything that seemed to threaten social order, folklore could absorb that fear and turn it into a body. A monster body. Something to blame. Something to hunt. Something to keep people in line. And that is where folklore gets complicated. Because on one level, these stories help people survive fear. But on another level, they create new victims. This is where the story stops being just spooky. Because folklore does not always stay inside stories. Sometimes it affects real people. With the aswang and manananggal, some historians and interpreters connect parts of the folklore to social control, gender, colonialism, and the fear of certain kinds of spiritual power. Before and during Spanish colonization, many indigenous Filipino communities had women who held important social and spiritual roles. Some were healers, some were ritual specialists, some were midwives. But this part needs a lot of care because it would be too simple to say everything before Spain was noble and everything after Spain was corrupt. History is messier than that. Pre colonial societies had their own violence, hierarchies, conflicts, and cruelties. Spanish rule also brought new religious, legal, and family structures that some communities have eventually embraced, while also bringing conquest, coercion, and suppression of older traditions. I don't want to frame this as a clean, good versus evil story. The more useful point is this: when one social order replaces another, the people who had authority under the old system can suddenly become suspicious under the new one. The Spanish did not simply invent the manananggal out of nothing. Older oral traditions almost certainly existed before Spanish documentation. But some scholars argue that colonial rule may have helped reshape, amplify, or antagonize certain figures, especially women connected with healing, birth, and spiritual authority. And when you look at the Manananggal through that lens, the symbolism is hard to ignore. A midwife helps bring life into the world. The Manananggal is imagined as a female figure who threatens that life. That does not prove one simple origin for the myth, but it does show how folklore can absorb social tension. A healer can become suspicious. A neighbor can become dangerous. A woman with knowledge can become feared. And a story can become a way of deciding who belongs inside the community and who should be pushed out of it. There's also a modern medical layer to this. In parts of Panay, especially around Capiz, some Filipino sources have discussed how X linked dystonia Parkinsonism, or XDP, may have contributed to local stigma and aswang associations. XDP is a real neurological disorder. It can cause involuntary movements, muscle contractions, and other severe symptoms. Before conditions like that were understood medically, people suffering from them could be interpreted through a supernatural lens. To be very clear, XDP does not explain the aswang. It should not be used to reduce a large, centuries old folklore tradition to one medical condition, but it does show something important. When a community does not understand illness, the person suffering can become the monster in the story. And that is cool, because now the person who needs help becomes the person everyone fears. This is where I think monster stories become dangerous. Not because people believed in something strange, but because belief can change how you treat a real human being standing in front of you. The same pattern appears in vampire panics too. Once someone was labeled a vampire, the fear did not necessarily end with them. Their grave could be violated, their family could be blamed, their memory could be rewritten into something monstrous. So, yes, folklore can comfort people. It can explain death, it can create warnings, it can give shape to grief. But it can also turn suspicion into certainty. And certainty can be terrifying. Today, vampires are almost unrecognizable from what they used to be. Modern vampires are often tragic, elegant, seductive, powerful. Sometimes they are villains, sometimes they are anti heroes, sometimes they are basically immortal celebrities with dental problems. But the older vampire was not glamorous. It was local, dirty, feared. They didn't sparkle. A dead person who still seemed to have unfinished business with the living. The aswang and manananggal also continue to change. They appear in Filipino horror, movies, comics, shows, urban legends, online stories, and family warnings. Sometimes they are treated as terrifying, sometimes as cultural symbols, sometimes almost playfully. But underneath the modern versions, the old fear is still there. A person who looks normal during the day but becomes something else when no one is watching. That is why the monster next door keeps working. It does not need castles, it does not need graveyards, it does not need old villages. You can move it anywhere: a rural house, a quiet subdivision, a city apartment, a hallway with one broken light. The shape changes, the fear stays. And I think that is why these stories are so hard to kill. We can stop believing in the literal monster, but we do not really stop fearing betrayal. Maybe people did not invent monsters just to explain the dark. Maybe they invented them to explain the moment when the familiar stopped feeling safe. When a loved one died but still seemed present. When a neighbor acted strangely. When disease moved invisibly through a family. When pregnancy turned dangerous. When illness made the body unfamiliar. When grief needed someone to blame. The vampire and the manananggal are different creatures from different worlds, but they reveal something uncomfortable about human fear. Sometimes we're not afraid of the unknown stranger outside the village. Sometimes we are afraid of the familiar person already inside it. The one who knows our doors, the one who knows our routines, the one who looks human. Because the only thing scarier than a monster outside your home is a monster who already belongs there. And if you like that video, please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more videos in the future. Thank you.